The cerebellum is important for movement and cognition. The cerebellum is a large, well-defined brain structure right here hanging off the back of the brain, and it's sometimes called the little brain. Now, it might be surprising that it's involved in cognition because for a while, people thought that the cerebellum was solely involved in the coordination of bodily movements. And in fact, while the cerebellum is undoubtedly crucial for coordination and the accuracy of movement, it is important for emotional regulation and executive functions, as well as verbal, linguistic, and visuospatial abilities. As we'll see in this video, while these functions seem very different, they may be specific instances of a more general function being performed by the cerebellum, having to do with prediction and internal modeling. In doing so, we'll look at specific deficits of movement and cognition that are commonly observed in patients with cerebellar damage. We'll also look at new research suggesting that stimulating the cerebellum may be used as a novel treatment for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Later on, to better understand how the cerebellum works, we will examine its anatomy and its connections to other brain regions. This will lead us to a discussion of what neuroscientists call the cerebellar microcircuit, and how this single neurological circuit helps explain both how the cerebellum works and how we learn to perform new kinds of movements. By the way, I'm Andrew and this is Sense of Mind. If you want more videos about the brain like this one, be sure to subscribe to this channel and sign up for our newsletter by going to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter or look for the link in the caption below. All right, back to how the cerebellum works. How exactly does the cerebellum do all these things? We'll cover two basic functions that help explain the cerebellum's function in motor and cognitive domains: feedforward sensorimotor control and internal modeling. Feedforward sensorimotor control. The cerebellum predicts which muscular contractions are necessary to perform a movement with accuracy and smooth coordination. It then uses sensory data as feedback to improve its prediction. Importantly, the cerebellum does not seem to plan movements so much as it modifies them on the fly. The premotor and motor regions of the cerebral cortex, which lie just behind the prefrontal cortex, plan the sequence of movements, whereas the cerebellum makes them smoother and more accurate. So if you're reaching for a cup in front of you, the premotor and motor cortex will plan and execute the sequence of actions that need to be taken by your arm and hand, whereas the cerebellum will make sure that the sequence is more seamless and ensure that you don't overshoot your reach and knock the cup over, for example. It will also ensure that the timing of the movement is right. If, for example, you have to grab the cup before it falls off the edge of the table. Now, this is called feed forward because rather than being completely reliant on sensory information, it is also predictive in nature. The cerebellum uses what is already known about the body and the specific action being taken in order to model what will happen in the immediate future. So how does the cerebellum know all these things? Cerebellar internal models. The cerebellum appears to employ two different types of internal models to control movement. First, the forward dynamic model. Just as when you copy or CC someone on an email who is not the most important recipient, the motor cortex essentially CCs the cerebellum on the message that it's sending to the body about how to move. That is, the cerebellum receives a copy of the motor command, and it then models what will happen to the limbs and other parts of the body as the action is taken. It uses this model, this prediction, to augment those movements so as to make them more smooth and accurate. Now, the second type of cerebellar internal model is the inverse dynamic model, which uses sensory information about the position of the body and limbs to generate a sequence of muscular contractions that will achieve the goal of the movement and make sure that it's properly timed. This is called inverse because, unlike the forward predictive model, it makes a prediction of how to move based on how the body is already positioned rather than what the motor cortex is planning to do. An important function that I barely mentioned is the cerebellum's role in the controlling of timing of motor actions, as well as timing involved in more cognitive tasks, such as estimating whether one stimulus was presented for longer than another in an experimental paradigm. But that is a very important part of cerebellar function, so just remember that timing is also something that the cerebellum does. Cerebellar ataxia. Ataxia refers to a lack of coordination of bodily movement. It's different from akinesis, which refers to a total lack of movement or the inability to move one's body. Damage to the cerebellum or diseases that affect its function commonly result in ataxia of one kind or another. According to Bastian and Lisberger in a chapter of the textbook Principles of Neural Science, for people with such damage, their movements appear, quote, jerky, irregular, and highly variable, end quote. And they're often unable to complete a movement without breaking it down into individual steps, though even that doesn't always work. Cerebellar ataxia can manifest in different parts of the body for different patients, and different terms are used to describe each type. Let's look at a couple here. For example, limb ataxia can be seen during a simple reaching task. If you ask someone with a healthy brain to start with their arm extended above their head and then to bring it back and touch their finger to their nose, they'll do that with a single smooth motion in which their hand moves in a straight line and their finger ends up precisely on their nose with very little difficulty. Someone with limb ataxia due to cerebellar damage, on the other hand, would move his hand in a rather convoluted, jerky, and swerving path that overshoots or undershoots its target, and it makes corrections as it goes. Also, as his hand approached his nose, it may get shakier and shakier the closer it gets. Finally, throughout the movement, he will be unable to coordinate the movement of his elbow with that of his shoulder, so he may break down the movement into individual shoulder and elbow movements and do these in sequence rather than all at once. The jerky path that over or undershoots its target is referred to as dysmetric movement, where the prefix dis means bad or difficulty, and metric refers to length or distance. The hand shakiness as it approaches his nose is referred to as an action or intention tremor, and it's like a microcosm of dysmetria. In other words, it's a series of undershooting and overshooting attempts at aiming the finger to touch the nose. The disjointed coordination between the elbow and the shoulder is an example of what is called decomposition of movement. And it may be due to the damaged cerebellum being less able to accurately predict how the various body parts will move in relation to each other given a series of muscle contractions. More generally, all three of these deficits, commonly seen in limb ataxia, may be explained by the fact that the damaged cerebellum is hampered in its ability to build internal models of the body and therefore to predict the outcome of a movement. Now, another example is cerebellar gait ataxia, which according to a 2002 study by Stoltz and colleagues is characterized by, quote, a widened base, increased foot rotation angles in combination with almost normal ranges of motion of the lower extremity and relatively unchanged gait velocity and stride length, which decreases in severe or late stages of the disease, end quote. Now, other sources note that patients take irregularly timed steps and they sometimes look as if they're drunk and unable to stay upright or walk in a straight line. Again, this is likely due to the damaged cerebellum's inability to accurately model or predict bodily movement. Slurred speech or irregular speech, as well as irregular eye movements, can also show up in cerebellar disorders. In all cases of cerebellar ataxia, as we've noted, part of the cause is the impaired prediction and internal modeling of bodily movements and their likely outcomes. Instead of being able to use a predictive template to control and coordinate movements, cerebellar patients may have to rely on much slower sensory feedback after the fact. As I mentioned earlier, however, the cerebellum is also involved in cognition and cognitive disorders. Let's look at how this works and whether this area of cerebellar research might one day help doctors to treat dementia. The cerebellum in cognitive disorders. The cerebellum has extensive indirect functional connections with the cerebral cortex. This is relevant because the cerebral cortex can be seen as the neurological seat of complex thought, emotion, and behavior, with the caveat that without the subcortical regions beneath the cortex, there would be no thought, emotion, or behavior. That's especially true of emotion, which relies on regions like the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus, in addition to many areas of the cortex. Interestingly, the cerebellum also has indirect functional connections to these so-called limbic regions as well. When I say, quote, indirect functional connections, I mean that the cerebellum is connected to these brain areas via a relay station in the brainstem. That's the indirect part. but they are functionally connected in the sense that they strongly affect each other's activity. We'll talk more about these cerebellar cortico-limbic connections when we get to the section on anatomy. But for now, it's important to note some of the ways that different areas of the cerebellum are involved in different kinds of non-motor behavior and cognition. Cerebellar vermis in affect. Right down the midline of the cerebellum, between the right and left hemispheres, is a strip of tissue called the vermis, from the Latin term for worm, kind of looks like a worm. In motoric behaviors, this area helps control posture and eye movements, but in non-motor behavior, this region is associated with emotional or affective processing. When this region is damaged, it can lead to a general flattening of emotional behavior or to more impulsive, less inhibited behavior. Not only that, a 2013 review by Blatt, Oblak, and Schmamann noted that abnormalities in the cerebellar vermis or its connections are related to clinical depression. Furthermore, they explain that, quote, vermal abnormalities appear to account in large part for the emotional disturbances, inappropriate behavior, and changes in affect that characterize the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. And that syndrome is the set of cognitive and emotional symptoms that sometimes come with cerebellar damage. So what about non-emotional deficits? Right cerebellar hemisphere in language disorders. If you watched my interview with the language neuroscientist Dr. Greg Hickok, you'll know that the old idea that all language functions of the human brain are isolated to the left hemisphere is not true. However, as Hickok noted, it's partly true because verbal, that is, writing and speaking of language, as opposed to reading or understanding of it, is mainly on the left side of the brain. So it's a curious fact that selectively damaging the right hemisphere of the cerebellum is associated with verbal language deficits. This oddity can be explained by the fact that the cerebellum's connections with the cortex are crisscrossed, or contralateral in anatomical jargon. For example, a 2010 study published in the journal Cortex of patients with cerebellar damage found that, quote, 8 patients presented with right-sided cerebellar damage, of whom 5 patients showed typical left hemisphere dysfunction, including disrupted linguistic skills, meaning disrupted naming and verbal fluency, disrupted verbal working memory, impaired planning, and deficits in logical reasoning, executive functions. By contrast, only 1 patient with left-sided cerebellar damage presented with linguistic deficits, disturbed verbal fluency, while none of the patients with left-sided cerebellar damage showed disturbances in verbal working memory. And the right cerebellum's language functions go further. In a consensus article published in the journal Cerebellum, written by many of the world's top researchers, they said, quote, the right cerebellar hemisphere is embedded within a distinct neural network devoted to the processing of grammar, together with the basal ganglia and the language-dominant left prefrontal temporal and parietal cortex. However, the right cerebellum is not just concerned with language. As a 2021 study published in Frontiers in Psychology explained, quote, participants with right-sided cerebellar lesions demonstrated a general deficit of cognitive functioning, with impairments not only in language and verbal fluency, subscales, but also memory, attention, and visuospatial functions. So the right cerebellum is mostly about language, but possibly logical reasoning and other cognitive functions to some extent as well. So what about the left side? Left cerebellar hemisphere in visuospatial disorders. The left cerebellum appears to be more involved in visuospatial functions and attention. As that same 2021 study I talked about above notes, quote, left-sided cerebellar lesion patients scored lower than controls in attention and visuospatial domains, but not in language fluency and memory functions, end quote. Other studies have come to similar conclusions, and it's thought that this lateralization of visuospatial and attention to the left cerebellum reflects its connections with the right cerebral cortex. This may also help account for difficulties with executive function commonly experienced by patients with widespread cerebellar damage. Now, taken together, these cognitive and emotional functions seem to be related to the cerebellum's unique role in the pathology of dementia as well as Alzheimer's disease in particular. The cerebellum in dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, which according to the CDC is, quote, a general term for the impaired ability to remember, think, or make decisions that interferes with doing everyday activities, end quote. Neuroscientists believe that Alzheimer's is caused partly by the buildup inside of the brain of protein clumps called beta amyloid plaques and tangles of fibrous material called neurofibrillary tangles. It also has to do with a loss of connections among neurons throughout the brain. The National Institutes of Health note that the accumulation of these biomarkers often begins in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, areas specifically involved in memory, and that it later spreads to other brain regions at different rates. So what about the cerebellum? Curiously, as explained by Catherine Liang and Eric Carlson in a 2020 review, the cerebellum is the last brain region to develop these biomarkers. Not only that, but as Liang and Carlson note, quote, genetic markers of cellular aging in the cerebellum accumulate more slowly than in the rest of the brain, and it generates unknown factors that may slow or even reverse neurodegenerative pathology in animal models of Alzheimer's. Cerebellum shows increased activity in early Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, suggesting a compensatory function that may mitigate early symptoms of neurodegenerative pathophysiology, end quote. If, as these authors suggest, the cerebellum is indeed involved in protecting the rest of the brain from neurodegeneration, what implications does this have for treating Alzheimer's disease? Stimulating the cerebellum to treat Alzheimer's disease. In a 2022 study published in the journal Brain Stimulation by Yao and colleagues, the researchers wanted to know if stimulating the cerebellum could help with some of the cognitive deficits observed in patients with Alzheimer's disease. In half of these patients, the authors used transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to stimulate the cerebellum. But in the control half of patients, they only pretended to do the stimulation, something they call sham TMS. Now, TMS uses a magnetic field to induce electrical activity in neurons and neural circuits in specific areas of the brain. They did this for 20 minutes at a time, 5 days a week, for 4 weeks, specifically aimed at the cerebellum. At the end, while there was considerable variation, the authors showed statistically significant improvements for the group that received TMS in their scores on an Alzheimer's assessment scale, as well as in several measures of cognitive ability. So the authors write that, quote, therefore, targeting RTMS at the bilateral cerebellum can improve various cognitive domains more than other targets like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus, end quote. To cap off this section on the cerebellum in cognition, emotion, and non-motor behaviors, I want to try to tie all of this to the cerebellum's more general functions. As we noted at the outset of this video, the cerebellum is about prediction and internal modeling. In the motor domain, it predicts which muscular contractions are necessary to perform a movement with accuracy and smooth coordination. It then uses sensory data as feedback to improve that prediction. But what about the cognitive domain? It appears that the cerebellum might be performing a role analogous to what it does for movement. And here I'd like to quote Liang and Carlson one last time. Quote, cerebellar modulation of cortically based cognitive functions is thought to occur through detection of pattern changes and errors in thought, providing adaptive feedback to the cerebral cortex, and by encoding internal models that reproduce essential properties of mental representations in the cerebral cortex, which may underlie implicit thoughts and intuitions. As interesting as that is, there is a giant hole in this discussion of the cerebellum. That is, how does the cerebellum do any of this? How is the cerebellum organized anatomically? What do its various subregions do? How does it connect with other brain regions? How does it work at the level of individual neuronal circuits? And what does this tell us about ourselves as thinking and learning organisms? These questions will be the focus of the rest of the video, but to answer them, we first have to take a trip into the physical territory of the cerebellum and begin to map it out. Anatomy of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a well-defined brain structure hanging off the back of the brain, and it sits in an area of the skull called the posterior cranial fossa. The word cerebellum is Latin for little brain, and that's exactly what it looks like. In fact, just like the big brain, the cerebellum is anatomically divided into lobes, 3 in the case of the cerebellum, and those are the anterior, posterior, and oculonodular lobes. The cerebellum, like the rest of the brain, also has 2 symmetrical hemispheres that look like mirror images of each other. Also like the big brain, the cerebellum has a layered cortex, as well as nuclei and white matter tracts underneath. And by the way, the cortical tissue is mostly made up of whole neurons packed together, communicating with each other, whereas white matter tracts are bundles of fibers reaching far across the brain, and they consist of the axons of neurons, the cables that allow one neuron to send a message to another. And nuclei, on the other hand, are densely packed clusters of cell bodies of neurons. The axons of nuclei neurons often form the white matter tracts we just noted. Cerebellar connections to brainstem. As you might expect, from its location in the brain, the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem. Specifically, the cerebellum connects to the brainstem via 3 pairs of white matter tracts called peduncles, the inferior, middle, and superior cerebellar peduncles. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the main output fiber of the cerebellum, sending information to the brainstem as well as other brain regions. Cerebellar connections to cerebral cortex. The cerebellum and the cerebral cortex are connected in what are called recurrent loops, meaning that they send and receive information back and forth. Importantly, the connections from the cortex to cerebellum are not direct, but instead have relay points between them where information is consolidated, then sent to its final destination. The lateral areas of cerebellum send information to the cortex with a relay station in the thalamus. The cortex, on the other hand, sends information to the lateral cerebellum through a relay station called the pontine nuclei, which is located in a part of the brainstem called the pons. Now, in that same textbook chapter by Bastian and Lisberger, the authors note that in monkeys, the cerebellum connects with many areas of the cerebral cortex, and that includes, quote, substantial connections to motor, prefrontal, and posterior parietal regions. And if you watched my video on the prefrontal cortex, you'll know that all of these areas are heavily involved in movement, but more importantly, executive functions. In humans, the cerebellum may have even more widespread connections throughout the cortex, as there is evidence that the cerebellum communicates with much of the cortex. Finally, the cerebellum may also have connections to the basal ganglia, which is a set of structures critically involved in executing the movements commanded by the cortex, as well as the dopaminergic reward system. Now, let's turn to the anatomy of the cerebellum itself, beginning with the deep cerebellar nuclei. Packed in close to the center of the cerebellum are 3 distinct pairs of nuclei. These nuclei are the interposed, fastigial, and dentate nuclei, and there is one in each hemisphere of the cerebellum. Their purpose is to gather and process information from the cerebellum's cortex and then send that information to the rest of the brain via the connections we talked about earlier. While the bundle of axons, known as the superior peduncle, is the main output fiber of the cerebellum, these deep nuclei contain the cell bodies of those axons that form the peduncle. While we could spend a long time on these nuclei, I want to move on to where most of the neural computation occurs in the cerebellum, or at least where it's thought to, the cerebellar cortex. Anatomy of the cerebellar cortex. Okay, I can foresee some confusion here. Remember, we are not talking about the cerebral cortex, which is the folded and convoluted tissue forming the outermost layer of the big brain, but instead, we're concerned with the cerebellum's cortex, the cerebellar cortex. By looking at the anatomy of the cerebellar cortex, we will be able to understand how the cerebellum works by using an elegant mechanism involving all 3 cortical layers as well as the deep nuclei. Understanding this mechanism will make the cerebellum's many functions start to make sense as specific manifestations of a general computational algorithm. We're going to go into more detail in the following sections, but let's first look at a broad overview of the territory. To begin, the cerebellar cortex is divided into 3 layers, defined by the types of neurons that are present in them. Going from the innermost to the outermost layer, they are the granular, Purkinje, and molecular layers. Traveling vertically through these 3 layers are 2 different white matter tracts, the climbing and mossy fibers. In addition to these vertical tracts, there's a set of horizontal tracts that go across the molecular layer, the outermost layer called the parallel fibers. Now, to be clear, while the granular layer is the innermost layer of the cortex, it's not the innermost part of the cerebellum as a whole. Instead, the cerebellum is kind of like an onion with nuclei in the middle, white matter outside that, and cortex outside of that. Now let's examine the layers of the cerebellar cortex and their most important functions. Granular layer of the cerebellar cortex. This is the innermost layer. Its function is to receive information, sensory information, from the brainstem, as well as copies of any motor command sent to the body by the cerebral cortex. It then processes that information and transmits it to the outer layers of the cerebellar cortex. It's called granular because it contains tens of billions of extremely tiny neurons called granule cells, some of the most abundant cell types in the whole brain. Mossy fibers of the cerebellum. These granule cells receive all that sensory and motor information via white matter tracts called mossy fibers. While this information comes from the cortex and brainstem, it ultimately passes through the pontine nuclei in the brainstem before getting to the granular layer of the cerebellum. Note that the mossy fibers also send some signals directly to deep cerebellar nuclei. That's something we'll return to later. So mossy fibers send signals to granule cells in the granular layer. Granule cells, in turn, send signals to the neurons situated in the middle layer, the Purkinje layer of the cerebellar cortex. The functions of the neurons in this middle layer of cerebellar cortex are to A, process information both from the granule cells and from the rest of the brain, and B, to send that processed information to the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, so this layer is referred to as the output layer of the cerebellar cortex. Cerebellum Purkinje cells. The strange name for this layer comes from the fact that it is made up of a single sheet of a certain type of neuron called a Purkinje cell, named after a 19th century Czech anatomist, Jan Evangelista Purkinje. Purkinje cells have massive dendritic arbors that look like elaborate and intricate tree branches. Dendrites are the limbs of neurons that receive messages from other neurons' axons. So their elaborate branching means that they receive signals from many neurons. Purkinje cells are inhibitory GABA-releasing cells, meaning that they turn down the activity of their target neurons. You can check out my GABA video if you want to learn more about inhibitory neurotransmission. Now, in this case, those target neurons are the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. Now, just because the signals that the Purkinje cells send are inhibitory, that doesn't mean that they simply shut down the activity of those nuclei. Instead, there can be disinhibitory effects where, for example, a Purkinje cell inhibits a nuclei cell that is itself inhibiting other nuclei cells, so those two negatives make a positive and you get activation. Also, the deep cerebellar nuclei are a special type of neuron that activates spontaneously without stimulation by other cells, so inhibiting their activity is only temporary. Climbing fibers of the cerebellum. I noted earlier that in addition to processing the input from granule cells, the Purkinje layer also processes input from the brainstem. It gets this information via the second type of vertical fiber that I mentioned above, the climbing fibers, which originate in the brainstem. According to Bastian and Lisberger, quote, "The climbing fiber is so named because each one wraps around the proximal dendrites of a Purkinje neuron like a vine on a tree, making numerous synaptic contacts. And they have a very strong excitatory effect on the Purkinje neurons, producing a type of action potential called a complex spike. Finally, like the mossy fibers, climbing fibers also have some direct connections to the deep cerebellar nuclei. And again, we'll return to that later. Now, given that the Purkinje and granular layers are the output and input layers of the cerebellar cortex, you might be wondering what the molecular layer is for. To understand that, we need to take a step back. Molecular layer of the cerebellar cortex. The key to understanding what the molecular or outermost layer is all about is to realize that it contains very few cell bodies, and instead it is filled with the dendrites of the Purkinje neurons, as well as the parallel fibers mentioned earlier. In other words, while the cell bodies of the Purkinje neurons are in the Purkinje layer, their dendrites are almost exclusively in the molecular layer. The molecular layer is the area where the Purkinje neuron dendrites make contact with and receive information from the axons of climbing fibers and the granule cells. Parallel fibers of the cerebellum. One last detail before we get to the cerebellar microcircuit's general mechanism. We just said that the granule cells send information to Purkinje neurons. Now, to be clear, the granule cells' axons actually reach all the way up to the outermost layer, the molecular layer, and then make a turn so they go horizontally through the molecular layer. And in fact, these are the parallel fibers that I've been mentioning. The cerebellar microcircuit. Okay, so after trudging through all that neuroanatomy, you're ready to understand how the cerebellar microcircuit works. In explaining this, we will also summarize the sequence of information flow through the cerebellum. We will also be prepared to learn how the cerebellum is involved in motor learning. In my video on the evolution of the brain, I briefly mentioned that the cerebral cortex of the brain is rather like a patterned quilt with repeating units known as cortical columns that are made up of about 100 neurons each. Some neuroscientists believe that cortical columns are all performing the same basic computational algorithm with slight variations based on their inputs and outputs. I mention this because the cerebellum has an analogous quilt-like pattern of repeating units. Those are the cerebellar microcircuits. And similarly, some scientists believe that these microcircuits are each performing the same basic computational algorithm, but one that is different from that of the cortical column. Okay, it all begins with the Mossy and climbing fibers. These, as we noted, transmit information from the brainstem to the cerebellum. Specifically, the Mossy fibers transmit a copy of the motor commands from the motor cortex to granule cells. These fibers may also be transmitting information about the state of the body before a movement is executed. The climbing fibers, on the other hand, send signals to Purkinje neurons that may represent sensory feedback and prediction error. Both types of fibers send excitatory signals directly to the deep cerebellar nuclei as well. Here's one plausible way that this may work. The Mossy fibers excite granule cells, which then transmit an excitatory signal through their axons, known as the parallel fibers, to the Purkinje cells, telling them about the motor command so that they can help make it smoother and more accurate. During or after the action, the climbing fibers, which wrap around the Purkinje cells like vines, also activate the Purkinje neurons, relaying sensory information about whether or not the action accomplished its goal. So the Purkinje neurons are now firing a lot. And remember that the Purkinje neurons are inhibitory GABAergic cells, so when they fire, they slow down the firing of their target neurons. In this case, the target neurons are the deep cerebellar neurons. Okay, we're missing some details and cell types, but the basic picture is a situation where the Mossy and climbing fibers are sending excitatory signals to the deep cerebellar neurons, and the Purkinje neurons are sending inhibitory signals to those same deep cerebellar neurons. You might be wondering why the cerebellum essentially hits the gas and brake pedals on the cerebellar nuclei at the same time. What is the point of both exciting and inhibiting them? As Bastian and Lisberger explain, quote, neurons of the deep cerebellar nuclei are active spontaneously even in the absence of synaptic inputs. So the inhibitory output of Purkinje cells both modulates this intrinsic activity and sculpts the excitatory signals transmitted from the Mossy fibers to the deep nuclei, end quote. Furthermore, the deep nuclei constitute the output of the entire cerebellum. So they're taking in all of the signals from throughout the cerebellum, processing them, and then sending those signals back to the rest of the brain in order to control movement and cognitive functions. Mechanisms of cerebellar motor learning. Imagine you're picking up a jug of water that you believe is empty. When you go to grab it, however, it is much heavier than you expected, and so you apply too little force when picking it up. Now, the next time that you go to pick up that jug, you'll realize that it's full and you'll apply the right amount of force in picking it up. How is that possible? How does your brain recalibrate your movement such that you pick up the jug? More specifically, what role does the cerebellar microcircuit play in this form of motor learning? Let's say that there are now 2 jugs of water on the table, both of which you believe to be completely empty. You reach for the one on the left and you find that your prediction was correct. The jug is indeed empty. And this allows you to pick it up smoothly and accurately since you knew exactly how heavy it would be. In this case, Purkinje neurons will fire in rapid succession during the movement itself. Let's say you do this several more times with the same jug, picking it up again and again. Next, you're told that the jug on the right is also empty, but when you go to pick it up, you find that it's actually full. It's much heavier than you expected. So your first attempt is a failure. You don't pick it up because you didn't apply enough force. In this case, not only are the Purkinje neurons firing rapidly, but more importantly, the cerebellum is signaling that an error is occurring in that movement. More specifically, the climbing fibers, those vine-like fibers that synapse with Purkinje neurons, are receiving information from the body and the brain, indicating that the movement was not executed properly. During that incorrect movement, the climbing fibers are firing and they appear to be signaling the error to the Purkinje neurons, telling them that they need to change their firing pattern. The climbing fibers may be relaying sensory feedback to the Purkinje neurons in order to modulate their activity and make the movement more accurate. Now, once you get the hang of picking up the heavy jug, the climbing fiber activity stops and the Purkinje neuron activity is more normal or appropriate for the actual movements necessary for picking up the jug. This change in activity may be due to reductions in the strength of synapses between parallel fibers and Purkinje neurons. If the parallel fibers are carrying a copy of the motor command, then what may be happening is that the sensory feedback from the climbing fibers is informing the Purkinje neurons that the original motor command was inaccurate and the actions actually taken need to be modified. The Purkinje neurons may send this information to the deep cerebellar nuclei, which send it on to motor regions of the brain, thereby modulating the next attempt at the movement. Now that's one plausible mechanism, but researchers have found that it's likely just one among several mechanisms involved in motor learning in the cerebellum. Synaptic plasticity likely occurs not only at parallel fibers and Purkinje neurons, but in other areas of the cerebellum as well. In particular, the deep cerebellar nuclei are thought to undergo considerable synaptic plasticity. Whatever the overall mechanism turns out to be, according to Bastian and Lisberger, quote, "It is likely that the same learning mechanism is used for cognitive and emotional processing in addition to motor learning." All right, well, that is it. Thank you so much for listening to or watching this episode of Sense of Mind. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. Also consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.